You don't feel lost. You don't feel ignorant. If anything, you feel aware, sometimes painfully so. You can name what's happening inside you with unsettling accuracy, yet something remains suspended, as if life itself is waiting for you to arrive. There is a strange tension in knowing more than you can inhabit, a quiet fracture between clarity and movement, between insight and embodiment. Nothing is dramatically wrong, and that may be the problem. Because when nothing breaks, nothing forces change. You carry understanding like a second skin. It protects you, explains you, justifies you. But it also keeps you at a distance, from risk, from exposure, from becoming someone you can't fully predict. And somewhere in that distance a question lingers, not urgent, not loud, just persistent enough to stay with you long after the words fade. What happens when understanding is no longer the problem, but the place you've been standing all along, the quiet frustration of knowing more than you can live? There is a specific kind of frustration that rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive as crisis or collapse, but as a steady, almost polite pressure. You understand more than you once did. You see patterns, motives, consequences, and yet your life remains strangely untouched by that understanding. At first, this gap feels temporary, even reasonable. You tell yourself that insight needs time, that clarity will eventually translate into movement. But days pass, then years, and the distance remains. Your inner world becomes increasingly refined, while your outer life repeats familiar shapes. The imbalance grows quiet but unmistakable. What makes this frustration difficult to name is that it wears the mask of intelligence. You can explain yourself with precision. You can analyze your fears, your habits, your contradictions. From the outside, it looks like depth. From the inside, it feels like being perpetually prepared, yet never arriving. There is also a subtle shame woven into this state. If you already understand why you are stuck, what excuse remains? The mind keeps producing answers, but the body doesn't follow. And so, knowledge begins to feel less like a tool and more like a mirror, one that reflects the same image back at you, unchanged. Eventually, a quiet question starts to surface. Not dramatic, not urgent, just persistent. At what point did knowing become safer than living? When did understanding turn into a place to stay, rather than something that moves you forward? And what part of you is quietly invested in keeping it that way? Awareness as a burden rather than a breakthrough. Awareness is often described as a turning point, a moment where things finally make sense. But there is another side to it, one that receives far less attention. Awareness can arrive not as relief but as weight. The moment you see clearly, you also see how much you've been avoiding, and that clarity does not always feel like freedom. Once you become aware, ignorance is no longer available to you. You can't unknow what you've recognized in yourself. The patterns, the defenses, the quiet compromises, they remain visible. Even on days when you wish they weren't, awareness doesn't knock once and leave. It stays in the room. There is a strange exhaustion that comes with this, not physical, not emotional in an obvious way, but cognitive and existential. You are constantly registering your own inner movements. Every hesitation has a name. Every rationalization exposes itself before it fully forms. What's unsettling is how awareness refuses to take responsibility for change. It illuminates, but it does not carry. It shows you the terrain, but it never walks it for you. And so you stand there seeing everything more clearly than before, while feeling less capable of acting without contradiction. Over time, awareness can begin to feel accusatory. It reminds you quietly of what you're not doing. Not with urgency, not with judgment, just with presence. And that presence can feel heavier than confusion ever was, because confusion allowed movement without coherence. Awareness demands integrity. So a tension forms. You want clarity, yet clarity asks something of you. And when that request goes unanswered, awareness shifts from breakthrough to burden. Not because it failed you, but because it revealed a distance you can no longer ignore. When insight becomes a substitute for movement, there is a moment where insight stops being a doorway and becomes a room, not a place you pass through, but a place you occupy. You notice yourself doing it, turning experience into interpretation, turning tension into explanation. And the explanation feels like progress because it is clean, coherent, complete. But life is rarely complete, and movement is rarely clean. Insight can feel like action because it changes the internal landscape. It rearranges the narrative. It makes the past legible. It gives you language for what was once only sensation. In that sense, it is powerful. But it can also become a replacement, a way of staying in the mind while avoiding the cost of living. The cost is the part insight cannot pay for you. To move is to risk looking foolish, misjudging, choosing poorly, needing to revise yourself. To move is to discover that your clarity does not guarantee competence, and this is where many people pause, not because they lack understanding, but because they sense the humiliation of reality. So the mind offers a gentler alternative. Think a little more, read a little more, name it more precisely. If you can articulate the problem with enough elegance, maybe that will count as change. And for a while, it does. It produces a calm satisfaction, the feeling of being above the mess. But slowly something begins to curdle beneath that satisfaction, because you start to recognize the pattern: insight, relief, stillness, repetition. The same conclusions, reworded, the same self-awareness, rehearsed. And the more fluent you become, the more difficult it is to admit that nothing is moving, not externally, not where it actually matters. A certain kind of despair grows in this space, not the dramatic kind, but the intellectual kind, refined, contained, almost invisible. You know what you're doing, and yet you keep doing it. And that raises a question that doesn't feel philosophical anymore. What if your insight has become your way of staying safe? Because movement would demand exposure. And insight, when used as shelter, allows you to remain untouched. It gives you the comfort of awareness without the vulnerability of becoming. And somewhere inside you, you can feel the quiet bargain being made, not consciously, but consistently. The comfort hidden inside intellectual paralysis. There is a kind of stillness that feels earned. Not because it brings peace, but because it feels justified. When movement is postponed in the name of thinking, reflection gains a moral weight. It sounds responsible, careful, mature, and slowly immobility begins to feel like a choice rather than a loss. Intellectual paralysis rarely announces itself as fear. It presents as refinement, as depth. You are not avoiding action, you tell yourself. You are preparing for it. You are considering all angles, respecting complexity, avoiding naivete. In that framing, hesitation becomes a virtue. There is comfort here, even if it is rarely acknowledged. As long as you remain in thought, nothing can fully contradict you. Reality stays hypothetical. Consequences remain abstract. Your self-image stays intact, protected by nuance and qualification. The world cannot disappoint you if you never quite enter it. This comfort is subtle but persistent. It cushions you from exposure, from being seen trying, failing, misjudging. Inside the mind, everything can be revised endlessly. Out there, things harden. They resist reinterpretation. And resistance is precisely what paralysis avoids. Over time, the paralysis becomes familiar, not pleasant but reliable. You know its shape, its language, its rhythms, and familiarity, even when stifling, offers a strange form of safety. It asks nothing sudden, nothing irreversible. What makes this state difficult to leave is that it doesn't feel empty. It feels full of thought, full of understanding, full of inner activity. But fullness is not the same as movement. And saturation of insight can coexist with a life that remains strangely untouched. The comfort lies in that contradiction. So the question is no longer why you feel stuck. The question becomes quieter, more unsettling. What are you being protected from by staying here? And what part of you has learned to confuse safety with depth, stillness with intelligence, and hesitation with wisdom? Identity built around understanding, not risking. Over time, understanding can stop being something you do and start becoming something you are. It settles into identity quietly. You are the one who sees beneath the surface, who names what others only feel. The observer, the interpreter, the one who understands. And identities once formed begin to protect themselves. When understanding becomes central to who you are, risk takes on a new meaning. It is no longer just the possibility of failure. It becomes the possibility of disintegration, of acting in ways that contradict the image you inhabit. To risk is to enter situations where your clarity may not translate into control, and that threatens more than outcomes. It threatens coherence. There is a subtle hierarchy created here. Understanding feels elevated, while action feels crude, exposed, unfinished. Thinking remains precise, doing is messy. So the self aligns with the cleaner domain, not out of arrogance but out of a quiet preference for what feels intact. This identity is reinforced socially as well. Insight is admired, articulation is rewarded. Few question the absence of movement when the language is compelling, and so the role solidifies. The thinker, the analyst, the one who gets it. A position that offers recognition without requiring risk. But identities built this way have a cost. They narrow the range of what feels permissible. You begin to avoid situations where you might look confused, impulsive, unprepared. Places where understanding must follow action, not precede it. Places where you would have to learn publicly. Over time, a quiet tension forms between who you understand yourself to be and who you might become if you allowed yourself to act without full clarity. The identity demands consistency. Life, however, rarely offers it. And so staying within understanding becomes a way of staying intact. The unsettling question lingers beneath all of this. If your sense of self depends on understanding, what happens when understanding is no longer enough? What would it cost you to step outside the role that has kept you coherent but also contained? The subtle fear of acting and discovering limits. There is a fear quieter than anxiety and more discreet than doubt. It does not rush the body or cloud the mind. It simply waits, patient and observant. The fear of acting, not because of what might go wrong, but because of what might finally become undeniable. As long as you remain in thought, your potential stays intact, undefined, open, generous. You can imagine yourself as capable of many things, precisely because none of them have been tested. Action, however, has a different logic. It introduces limits, edges, resistance. To act is to discover where your clarity stops working, where insight fails to protect you from awkwardness, error, or inadequacy. It is one thing to understand a fear. It is another to watch yourself hesitate in real time, without the buffer of interpretation. There is something deeply unsettling about this exposure. Because limits, once revealed, cannot be theorized away. They show up in the body, in missed timing, in fatigue, in silence. They are not arguments to be debated, but facts to be endured. So the mind learns to delay. Not dramatically, not consciously. Just enough thinking, just enough refinement to postpone the moment of encounter. The encounter with what you can and cannot do. The encounter with yourself as you are, not as you understand yourself to be. This fear rarely feels like fear. It feels like caution, like discernment, like maturity. But beneath those respectable names, there is often a deeper avoidance, because discovering limits does more than disappoint. It collapses certain internal narratives, and once those narratives collapse, something is lost. Not just illusion, but possibility. The open-ended version of yourself that exists only in thought. So staying still becomes a way of preserving that version, unproven but unbroken. The question that lingers here is not whether you are capable, it is quieter, more uncomfortable. What part of you prefers possibility over reality? Not because reality is worse, but because it is final in a way thought never is. How clarity can deepen inner conflict instead of resolve it. Clarity is often imagined as the end of inner conflict, as if naming something dissolves it, as if seeing the mechanism is enough to stop it. But sometimes clarity does the opposite. It sharpens the conflict, gives it definition, makes it harder to escape. When you see your contradictions clearly, you can no longer rely on confusion as cover. You know what you want, and you know what you avoid. You recognize your patterns, and you recognize your excuses. The mind becomes a well-lit room where nothing hides easily. And in that light, the conflict does not disappear, it becomes undeniable. There is a particular kind of torment in knowing both sides too well. You understand the part of you that craves change. You also understand the part that clings to the familiar. You can articulate each argument with elegance, and because both sides make sense, neither side can simply be dismissed. So the conflict matures, it becomes sophisticated, and therefore harder to end. This is where clarity can feel like a trap, not because it is false, but because it reveals too much too soon. You see the cost of staying and the cost of leaving. You see how every option carries loss, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. The choice stops being romantic and becomes real. Philosophers have long noticed that consciousness can intensify suffering, not by creating pain out of nothing, but by adding reflection to it. The animal suffers and moves on. The human suffers and asks why, and then suffers again from the why. Clarity adds layers. It makes the wound legible, but also more present. So you may find yourself in a strange position. Not lost, not ignorant, just divided with precision. You can map your inner terrain perfectly, yet feel no closer to peace. Because the conflict is not a puzzle. It is a tension between desires that cannot both be satisfied. And this raises a question that is difficult to sit with. What if the problem isn't that you lack clarity, but that your clarity has made the conflict more honest? What if understanding has not resolved you, but exposed how many versions of you are still competing for the same life? The unsettling space between knowing and becoming. There is a space that rarely gets named, yet many people live inside it for years. It exists between what you understand and what you embody. Not ignorance, not failure, but suspension, a prolonged pause where insight accumulates, while life waits without comment. This space is unsettling precisely because it is quiet. Nothing collapses. Nothing forces a decision. You function, you reflect, you explain yourself convincingly. From the outside, there is no crisis. From the inside, there is a low-grade dissonance that never quite resolves. In this in-between state, becoming feels abstract. You can imagine it clearly, even vividly. You know what alignment might look like, what coherence could feel like. But imagination remains safer than incarnation. To become would mean letting understanding lose its central position. There is also a temporal distortion here. You feel ahead of yourself mentally and behind yourself existentially. Time seems to pass without fully passing through you. Moments are interpreted rather than inhabited. Life becomes something you keep preparing to enter. What makes this space difficult to leave is that nothing is obviously wrong. The suffering is subtle, almost intellectual, a sense of incompletion without urgency. You are not blocked, you are suspended. And suspension can last indefinitely when it carries the appearance of depth. Yet something keeps pressing from beneath that stillness. Not a solution, not a command, just a tension. The awareness that knowing was never meant to be a final state. That understanding points beyond itself, even when you resist the direction. And that remaining here is also a choice, even if it doesn't feel like one. So the space between knowing and becoming remains open, unresolved, uncomfortable, honest. It does not ask you to move quickly. It does not offer reassurance. It simply waits, holding a question you already understand too well. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. If you can see this space so clearly, if you can describe it with such precision, what exactly is keeping you here? And what would be lost if you finally weren't? If you've recognized yourself in this, it's not because your mind is weak. It's because your mind has become skilled at surviving without exposing itself. Understanding can be a shelter, a place where you stay articulate, coherent, and untouched by the consequences of attempting. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable realization, that what feels like stagnation is not always a lack of knowledge, but a quiet loyalty to what keeps you intact. To remain in thought is to remain untested. To remain untested is to remain possible. And possibility can be addictive when reality feels unforgiving. So the distance between knowing and becoming continues to exist, not as a problem to solve, but as a space you keep circling. A corridor you understand so well that it starts to resemble a home. And yet, even home can become a kind of confinement when you stay there for the same reason you once entered: safety. Maybe the question isn't how to cross that distance. Maybe the question is what you are preserving by not crossing it. What identity remains protected? What illusions remain intact? What disappointments remain hypothetical? If you stay with this thought for a while, you may notice something subtle. Not an answer, just a shift in how the silence feels. And in that silence, another question begins to form quietly and without comfort. In the next video, we'll stay with that question longer and look at what happens when the mind stops negotiating with itself and begins to face what it has been carefully postponing.